Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Texas Immigration Law Council's podcast, Sidebar Immigration. I'm our host, Kristen Etter, and before we get started with today's episode and our speakers, I want to introduce our podcast. At Texas ILC, we decided to create Sidebar because in the first month alone of the Trump administration, immigration policy and law has changed so much. We wanted to use this podcast as a way to explain the changes in the immigration landscape from the professionals in a way that is understandable and accessible to the public. Throughout our first season, we will dive into complex immigration issues through in-depth policy discussions and broader thematic conversations. This limited series will provide insight into the evolving landscape of immigration. Now, let's get started with our first episode. Hi, good afternoon, Bobby, Jessica, and Crystal. How are y'all doing today?
Doing good.
Yeah, excited for our first episode.
I am too. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm Kristen Etter. I'm the Director of Policy and Legal Services here at Texas Immigration Law Council. I've been a lawyer in Texas almost 25 years and primarily in the area of criminal defense, also where it meets the intersection of immigration.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Cisneros. I was born and raised in Laredo, Texas, right here on the U.S.-Mexico border. I practice here. I've been practicing for almost 7 years now. And I think I come to this work just one with the professional experience of being an immigration attorney in Texas, but two, the personal experience of just being someone that was born and raised on the border, right?
My name is Crystal Gomez. I'm one of the other managing attorneys at Texas Immigration Law Council, and also have been practicing in Texas as a private immigration attorney and in the nonprofit world for a little over a decade. The majority of my work has been in these types of situations, affirmative filings, folks who are trying to fix their paperwork affirmatively.
I'm just Bobby Painter. I'm one of the managing attorneys at Texas Immigration Law Council. I'm not a native Texan, but I've been living and practicing immigration law in Texas now for 11 years.
And that really brings us to the topic today that we're going to be talking about, which is immigration. What is immigration law today? And how do the federal and state executive orders that were recently passed by the new Trump administration and our state, how are they shaping immigration policy and impacting our communities? So I'm actually going to turn it over. Before we turn it over, actually, Bobby, you're the one that got me thinking about this particular question because we've been planning for months for an incoming Trump administration. And Bobby, Jessica, and Crystal, you all have been practicing immigration lawyers in our state for years. And you actually were the one that got me thinking about this. And, what is immigration law? Do we even have immigration law anymore? And how has immigration law really been turned upside down on its head, really in the last 3 weeks? And before we start that, I want to talk about a little bit. The goal of this podcast is really to help the average everyday person that is not in the weeds in immigration law understand how these immigration laws and policies that are changing impact immigrants, immigrant communities, and really all of us, since every aspect of our life is truly impacted by immigration. And so I really want this to be designed to be a podcast so that people can listen to this and have a real understanding about what the accurate impacts are, what the accurate new changes in terms of federal and state policies are, and how they impact everyday people in Texas. So again, Bobby, that was really a question I've thought a lot about since you said, like, do we have immigration law anymore? I mean, what do you say to that?
Well, that's a big but really good question. And just so I guess to answer the question, let's back up to your first question, which is what is immigration law? And there are, I think, two ways you could approach this question. The first is kind of the strict, narrow interpretation to say immigration law is what's contained in the Immigration and Nationality Act, which is a statute, a law passed by Congress quite some time ago that's been amended a few times, though not very recently, to make a few changes. And then all of the rules and policies that different agencies at the federal level make to enact that law. That's one way to look at it, perhaps. But I think the more useful way to look at it is really any aspect of federal or state law that touches members of the immigrant community. So not just the INA, the Immigration and Nationality Act, but family law provisions that affect immigrants, specifically criminal law, and how criminal law now intersects with immigration law, and that gives you a more holistic picture of what immigration law in this country is. To the second part of that question, do we have it anymore? I think the answer is, I'm going to do the classic lawyer cop out and say the answer is yes and no. I say no because we've certainly seen over the past month a number of significant restrictions come down within the immigration law context on how you can immigrate to the US, certainly if you're trying to seek asylum, to the point where effectively there isn't a functioning asylum system for anybody who's attempting to come to the US and seek that relief now.
And what do you mean by that, Bobby? How do
Right.
you mean that there's no longer an asylum system? I mean,
A
isn't that a
number-
federal law that dates back decades? Like, what happened to asylum? And
So
what
you're
does that
right.
do to people that are
It
trying
is.
to come to our country for safety? They fear persecution.
It is still a federal law. It's still part of the INA, and the INA has certainly not been rescinded. And that section of the INA is based on longstanding international law precedents around refugee protection. So the framework is all still there. But what we've seen with a lot of the executive orders that have come down since the 20th of January is pauses or additional restrictions or requirements or limitations on how that law is implemented that effectively make it impossible. If you're a family trying to cross the border and request relief today, it's basically impossible to access that mechanism, even though it does still exist in principle.
Yeah,
So
I'll go
that's
ahead and jump in
okay.
on this because I have an example that we actually talked about yesterday. As we're talking about, like, in theory, yes, there are laws, right? There are laws that are supposed to apply to immigrants and create these processes. But for example, yesterday, we were working with a partner organization reviewing a web page that they host about what seeking asylum on the border looks like today. We're trying to give it an update. And I was just like stumped because it was like, how do I review this when I know in practice, there really isn't a mechanism or a process for people to be able to request asylum at the border. So it's like theoretical, and then in practice, what is actually happening is completely different, right? And I think that is true, and something that, as we're discussing a lot of the changes that we're seeing, a lot of the federal and state executive orders that we'll be talking about today, it's like this is what it says, but then in practice, it looks completely different. And to me, as a border resident, it's like I know something is working when I don't know anything about it because that means it's doing its job. But the fact that there's so many people here on the border that understand that things aren't working and that they're broken and things are problems that we have today that we didn't have even 8 years ago, right, are really just becoming a pain point for a lot of people here on the border. And not the pain points that I think, politicians with trying to like play up a lot of the issues that aren't really the focus of what people are thinking about, especially here. Like, for example, when I heard about the executive orders and the increased restrictions and additional surveillance, it's like, oh, great. Like, it's going to take longer at the bridge for me to go visit my family members, right? Or, I have family members who are truck drivers. It's like, great. That's just going to cause even more delays in the work that they're doing. And coming from Laredo, where it's just a huge trade port, I mean, it really affects the day to day in that way. So immigration law is not just, relating to folks that weren't born here, but even citizens are starting to feel a lot of its effects today.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, Jess. And it brings me really to a question for you, Crystal. And that is, before we get into the specifics of the executive order, just generally speaking, some of these federal executive orders, what about the tens of thousands of people that have come here, quote unquote, the right way? What is happening to some of these lawful immigration policies and orders under, for example, the previous administration? That allowed people to come the right way, to ask for permission, to wait have an appointment to enter, to be, applying from their home countries. So can you talk a little bit about, before we get into the ins and outs of the executive order, what is happening to all these people that have come the right way?
That's a really good question. And so what we're seeing right now, we hear the rhetoric, you're right. We hear people talking all the time about how, well, it's not all immigration. We're not against immigration. We're against illegal immigration, and how they draw this huge distinction between the two. And it's just not true. What we see is an attack on immigration all across the board. It's not just an attack on illegal immigration. And we see that with the redirection of resources away from affirmative filings and into enforcement. We see that with the cancellation of programs like CHNV, the Cuban, Haitian, Nicaraguan, Venezuelan parole program.
And let me back up. The CHNV, that was a program where people had to apply from their home countries, right?
Right.
So could you explain to the listeners? I mean, these are people that followed the law, applied from a home country, were granted permission to travel from their home country. So tell us a little bit more about that. And what happens to those people now that did it the right way?
It's been decades since we've had immigration reform. And in the course of that time, things have changed politically around the world. The number of people who are seeking to come to the US has changed. The countries they're coming from has changed. And so CHNV was supposed to be this mechanism by which, sure, we haven't passed meaningful immigration reform to make it easier for people who are fleeing unrest or political issues in their home countries to come here. So we're going to do the stopgap measure by creating this parole program where you can, if you're from one of these 4 countries, apply while you're in your country. If you come here and you try to do it, you're not eligible anymore. This program's only for you in your home country to apply for. Then once we make sure that you're who you say you are and that you've got support here to make sure that you're not going to become, subject to the state having to support you financially, then okay, you can come. So all these folks that we created this mechanism for, asked them, told them that they could come after we vetted them. They got here and now we're canceling the program, and there's no way they came here the right way, but there's no path to try to fix their paperwork now.
And can I just jump in for 1 second?
Yeah, of course.
Delineate one thing. So, and the air quotes around the right way are very noted, but I think it's important for the listeners to understand that 2 things. I guess the first is that when we're talking about asylum specifically, the idea of the right way is a little bit confusing because it gives people the sense that there is a specific way that you're supposed to do it. And that's not exactly true, because under the Immigration and Nationality Act, it doesn't matter whether you're in status or you're out of status, whether you entered the country on a visa with parole or with no status at all, you entered illegally. You are always lawfully allowed to apply for asylum, and there's nothing unlawful about crossing the border illegally and then seeking asylum. Now, there is something unlawful about the actual act of physically crossing the border without permission, but the subsequent request for asylum is wholly legal.
Yeah, and in fact, I mean, can you explain to the listeners, like, is it even possible to request asylum from your home country?
No, that's a common misconception. You hear so you see in movies and you hear people talk about the idea of kind of going to American soil, like at an embassy, and requesting asylum. And I think that does happen in very rare instances, generally with very high profile individuals. But typically that's not an option for the vast majority of people who are trying to seek protection from the United States government. The only other options you have are to enter into a formal refugee resettlement program usually in some 3rd country, which can take years to get through because there's so many different layers of vetting that have to apply to you before you're approved to enter. And of course, we'll get to this later on in the podcast. That program has been suspended indefinitely, so that option is no longer available. Or you can try to enter on one of these sort of stopgap programs like the one that Crystal's been talking about, which was specifically intended to address people from those countries showing up at the southern border and requesting asylum, creating this illusion of chaos and a crisis. Those were the nationalities most heavily represented among asylum seekers at the border, so those are the ones who were targeted by that parole program. And to Crystal's point, this is a product of us as a country and Congress not effectively addressing the inadequacies of the immigration system a long time ago. So now we're finding ourselves in reactive mode, trying to address a crisis after it's happened, when with the tools we have to do that are more limited.
And also, I mean, of note, in everyday conversations, asylee and refugee are used interchangeably. But when you tell an immigration attorney, like, is it possible for someone to seek asylum outside of the US? The answer is no, because the law, as it states, like, who can be an asylee? You actually have to be in the United States or at a port of entry to be able to seek asylum. So it's been really fascinating to see, like, even, you know, during the first Trump administration, where it seemed like really the only way that people could, seek this kind of protection was crossing outside of a port of entry, because folks that showed up to the port of entry were just turned away.
Well,
So that's
yeah.
also a really important thing to talk about, because you're hearing one thing of, like, we want to encourage people to do things, quote unquote, the right way, but there is no way to do that in practice. And we're seeing that this time around as well.
Right. I think I heard the borders are Tom Homan the other day say if they really want to come to the United States, they can just go to a port of entry and request asylum there. Is that accurate or not accurate?
For a number of reasons. One, the Border Patrol, I don't know if there's still a formal policy authorizing this, but for a long time they were engaging in a process called metering, which meant that they were limiting the number of people who could actually walk up to the border point of entry without an appointment every day and seek asylum. But even beyond that, because of sort of collaboration agreements that we have with the Mexican government, my understanding from reports that I read is it's actually very difficult to even get to the point of entry, because Mexican security forces are impeding people who are attempting to walk up without appointments as well. So we're talking about maybe dozens, perhaps hundreds, but a very low number of people who can actually even make it to a Border Patrol officer to make that request, as they're allowed to do under US law.
And so what you're saying, Bobby, is, and it's been the case for a while, right, that Mexican officials on the Mexican side have prevented people from being able to actually even get to a port. And that's assuming that you could actually ask for asylum or ask for entry at a port, which, as Jess just explained, is not a thing.
That's right. That's
But
right. Yeah.
so there's really just a prevention from actually even accessing. And then let's say you were able to get through, you come to the port of entry, there's still no mechanism.
That's right. And it's gotten worse since the new administration took power, because the whole premise of that system was that there was a way to make an appointment using that CBP1 app that some of the listeners might have heard about.
Yeah. And could you talk a little bit more about the CBP1 app and what happened to that CBP1 app?
Sure. This was another Biden administration effort to try to sort of normalize or regulate the flow of asylum seekers approaching the southern border by allowing them to use an app on their phone effectively to schedule an appointment with the Border Patrol to walk up and request asylum. The app was extremely problematic for a number of reasons. One, that's not what the INA says. It doesn't say you need to use the app fundamentally. But two, there were issues with accessing it. The app was glitchy. It didn't support a lot of languages that asylum seekers spoke. For a long time, you couldn't even download or use the app if you weren't fairly close to the border. And even then, if you got all of it to work correctly, you might be waiting 9 months before an appointment becomes available. But that was the idea that the Biden administration was attempting to follow, is we can make this more orderly if we have technology and people have appointments. But effectively what it did is left a lot of people stranded in Mexico for an indefinite period of time, waiting to show up at the border. The Trump administration, in one of their first executive orders, canceled that program, and it was eliminated, and the app was taken down almost immediately. So now we're in a situation where we have all of those same restrictions at the points of entry that we were just describing, but there actually is no other way to get there. You can't make an appointment to walk up and request asylum anymore. So effectively, as Jessica was saying, there's no way to do this.
So in essence, if we take and we can kind of go through the executive orders in a little bit more detail, but again, it brings me to my point of, do we even have immigration law in terms of, is there lawful immigration anymore? And if so, what can a person do if they want to come into the country? If, If it sounds like we've gotten rid of the CBP1 app, we've gotten rid of the Refugee and Resettlement Program, which we'll talk about in a little bit. We've shut down the border to asylum seekers. You can no longer do that. So, it brings me really to, I guess, let's talk about, we can go right into the first executive order that I wanted to bring up, which is guaranteeing states protection against invasion. So, Jess, you just did a really good analysis of all of the most recent federal and state executive orders, and hopefully we'll have time to talk about both and how they interact. But what does that one do? Why do they use the word invasion? Was there ever an invasion at our border? And what is the purpose of this particular executive order?
Yeah, I think before we jump into like all of them, because it's like very overwhelming, and I'm really glad that we have podcasts like this, right, where we just distill the information that people really need to know, because it's pretty daunting. I mean, that first day of January 20th, like it was like an onslaught of executive orders, and Bobby Crystal and I kind of divvied it up, of trying to figure out like what each of these mean. And then, all I did was put it together, right? But it was truly a team effort just because it was like so much.
Yeah. Where did we see these executive orders come from? They had a very, very specific blueprint under Project 2025 that these all appear to come straight out of, right? So these are things that we had been reviewing for a long time, we had been preparing for a long time. I think it's safe to say none of the things that have happened with these executive orders were really unexpected because they were in Project 2025.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was helpful because at least we knew what to expect. But obviously, I mean, there's still that shock, right, of it happening, and it's like, oh, okay, like we knew, but just seeing all of these changes come at once, and I think one of the most surprising ones that I'll let one of my colleagues speak about when we're reviewing all of this is the birthright citizenship one, right? Like, and again, we're talking about immigration. We're talking about like, I think people have this conception of like, it only affects people who weren't born here. It's like, no, like it's really affecting even citizens, right? So just to frame this a little bit, these federal executive orders are truly a comprehensive overhaul of immigration policy. It affects everything from border enforcement. You mentioned refugee admissions. I just mentioned citizenship recognition. There's also treatment of certain organizations as foreign terrorist groups. And it's interesting to see, I guess, the language that they use for a lot of these orders, because I think someone who is not familiar with how immigration law is actually implemented, it sounds like a great idea, right? Like, oh yeah, I can get behind these things, or at least some of them. But then you start putting, I mean, as people who have worked in this area for such a long time, you start putting the context of what this is actually going to look like in practice. I mean, it just really does affect, day-to-day stuff. Like an example of one of the executive orders that we'll talk about in a bit is like the rescission of so many concepts and protections that had existed in the past, like for example the safe spaces, right? Like that's going to be one that we'll be talking about, because now it's basically telling ICE that enforcement can happen anywhere. It can happen in schools, it can happen in hospitals, it could happen in churches. There are places that we go there all the time, right? So it just really trying to hammer this point that it doesn't just affect immigrants, but it really affects anybody, even citizens.
Yeah. And I guess I was going to say, before we dive in, you'd mentioned the safe spaces. And I know that this is one that we get a lot of questions. And Crystal, you've been doing a lot of work with schools and parents and community members that are concerned about this. Can you talk a little bit about what the safe or sensitive spaces was and how it's changed now under these executive orders?
Yeah. So the sensitive locations memo was an internal ICE memo that was in place during a lot of our past administrations, except for the Trump administrations. Basically told ICE officers, look, these places are off limits. Schools, churches, and hospitals. We know people need to be able to seek medical care. We don't want to scare people. Off limits. Churches, people should have the right to freely exercise their religion. That's off limits. Schools, obviously kids, off limits. And so what we saw Trump do, along with a lot of other very common sense directives, internal directives, was rescind all of those. So that, as Jessica was saying, it just tells ICE officers it's no longer off the table. If you feel like you need to do immigration enforcement in a school, then you're allowed. Nobody's
And
going
would
to.
that include like elementary schools? Like there's just, they can
It's
march
there,
into an elementary school if they want.
right? And what we've heard, the like dicta, the language people are using about this is that an immigrant should not ever feel safe in the United States. That's what they want, is for people
Why
to
do
not
they
feel
want
safe.
that? Like, what is the point of creating all of this terror, fear, and anxiety? Why don't they want immigrants to feel safe in our country? What is the purpose of that?
I think the idea is to hope that people will self-deport. Be like, if you're here because you want to be in a safer location than your home country, we're going to make it as unsafe for you here as possible so that so your home country now feels like a better plan. Um, which is obviously created by people who don't know what real persecution is in other countries, don't know what real poverty is in other countries, don't know what it's really like to have your kids be conscripted into gangs and things like that, and why people are fleeing. So yes, it's terrible to not have a safe location anymore, but that's still different than what people were going through in their home country.
And if the goal, I guess, under that theory is to make our communities worse off than some of the worst places that these people are fleeing from, what does that say about the rest of us that are also living in these communities?
We're not, I know that where I live, it's a mixed community. A lot of people with mixed status around me, my neighbors. These policies don't just affect the people that they claim that they're only affecting.
Yeah. So just getting back to you, I think we were talking about the invasion. And again, I mean, we use these words. I think these words are used very intentionally. But, those first two executive orders, guaranteeing states protection against invasion, protecting the American people against invasion. What is the history of that kind of rhetoric? And why are we seeing this in both state and also federal level policy changes?
Yeah, so I think it's important, like to someone who wants to enact these kinds of policies, which obviously the federal and our state government here in Texas are a want to. If you frame it as a national security issue, if you frame it as a national security threat, calling it an invasion, it allows certain provisions to be enacted that wouldn't be allowed under other circumstances, right? And I mean, it's really unfortunate, right, to see a community and regions across the United States, including my own, just being used as a scapegoat because we see what these kinds of effects like have locally, right? When people are afraid of showing up to church or sending their kids to school or um, frequenting, local restaurants or businesses, right? Because they're just afraid of leaving their home. It makes Texas weaker. And it really affects, our day to day. And instead of enacting policies that would allow all of us to prosper and thrive, unfortunately, we're falling into this political theory that's just affecting Texas. And this one is one of those, right? So what we're seeing with this, I believe that executive order was called Guaranteeing the State's Protection Against Invasion. This is a big reason why Bobby, Crystal, and I are saying that the border is effectively like closed because if folks might remember from the first Trump administration, there were policies enacted called MPP, Migrant Protection Protocols, Title 42. And what these orders did, or these directives did, were basically increase rapid removals along the border. So like if you were to cross, which again, we talked about how that was really the only way that people could access these or attempt to access these kinds of protections, instead of having a chance to see an immigration judge or have the chance to tell your story to an asylum officer for the opportunity to continue seeking asylum here in the United States, that was basically off the table. And with this new executive order, it it also comes along with increased enforcement, right, along the border regions. And that affects both new arrivals, it affects residents like me here in border communities. And I think the most upsetting part of all is that there is no timeline as to, okay, when is the invasion over? Like, when can we say that it is done? The order basically said it continues until the president declares that the invasion has ended. So again, I think for me, it's like I really see it firsthand of like how these policies change because folks that and not Texas specifically, because we're still a border state, but let's say someone that might be deeper, right, in the United States that they don't see, I guess, what the increased enforcement looks like here. I think if anybody, drives south from San Antonio heading into Laredo, folks are surprised to see that there's a checkpoint here that for me it was very normal, right? Like even going on school trips to San Antonio to Six Flags Fiesta Texas or anything like that, wondering why some of my classmates weren't joining us on this fun trip. It's because of that, right? Because we have to cross these checkpoints. There's additional border enforcement that folks along the border have to deal with as well. And then also when you're driving down here, folks are also surprised to see how many law enforcement vehicles you spot immediately on your way down, or even driving, let's say, from someone from Laredo was heading to Brownsville or South Bade Island, right? Sometimes it becomes a game of like, how many law enforcement cars can I count? Because it is really excessive. And to folks here in the border, again, when we're talking about like, well, what are actually the problems that we're facing here? I doubt a lot of them will say that we need increased, that the number one issue or the number one fix is that we need more border enforcement. Most folks usually talk about either healthcare or, trying to increase resources for educational programs down here in the border. So that's a lot of the frustrations that I think a lot of people are now starting to deal with even more as a result of this executive order. And Crystal can tell us a little bit more about this right now, but I think this is one of those areas where it connects with what the state is doing through their own executive orders. Because if you've been following the news, some Texas agents have been deputized to act as immigration officers. So I'll pass it over to Crystal to talk a little bit about that nexus there.
Yeah, I also wanted to talk a little bit about the parallel that we see in Texas with the disaster declaration, the invasion language, the emergency declarations. So the way that the president has declared an invasion and that's going to last until he says that it's over. We're seeing a really similar thing in Texas and have been seeing this for a while, right?
Right.
Where
And that's the Operation Lone Star that you're referring to, which is a policy in Texas where our governor declared an emergency in 2021 and has re-upped that emergency every 30 days in our state, the emergency being immigration at the southern border. Really,
so
despite the reduction in numbers or the fluctuation, whether they're up, whether they're down, they continue to renew that emergency over and over and over.
And it's really convenient because declaring an emergency gives the governor certain authority that he wouldn't otherwise have because we have separation of powers, we've got a legislative branch. And so the idea of this disaster declaration is supposed to be something's going on in the world or in your state. And so we're going to give this governor limited time, limited power because the legislature only meets every 2 years to be able to handle this disaster in the moment. And he's been doing this, re-upping this disaster declaration through several legislative sessions, which is not what it's not what it's designed to be. It's supposed to be like another stopgap measure to get you through a disaster. So it's really convenient to keep re-upping it every 30 days. And there's no limitation whatsoever on the governor doing this. He can do this for the next 10 years. And it gives him wild amounts of authority that he wouldn't otherwise have because we have a system of checks and balances, or we're supposed to.
And what about the access to funds? I mean, it's been an $11 billion program that's with a B. And I see that they're asking for an additional $5 billion now, even though supposedly the border is quote unquote secure or shut down. So,
fewer deportations under this administration than ever, fewer border crossings now than they were before. Exactly. And it doesn't matter. And this is the same justification that they used for GA 46 before, in November, which.
And what's, you want to explain to the listeners what GA 46 is?
Yeah. So GA 46 was another executive order by the governor in response to the disaster at the border, with air quotes at the disaster. It was at a point where we had the lowest border crossings in years at that time, but he still created this executive order directing any hospital that provides emergency services to ask about immigration status of the people seeking services and to track how much money was spent on their care. So it's obviously, we've been worried about a chilling effect with people not seeking emergency services for themselves or for their family members if they have a mixed status family. And we've advised folks that they don't have to answer, they can decline to answer, and that's okay. But that is normally the job that would be given to the legislature to create a bill and pass a law. But because of this disaster declaration that's just indefinite, the governor can just do on his own authority.
Yeah. And I guess, Bobby, bringing it back up to you, I mean, what do you see as Texas's role in all of this in enforcing, or I guess assisting, a mass deportation campaign at the federal level?
Texas certainly sees itself and wants to position itself as something of a force multiplier in the federal effort to really ramp up enforcement by devoting its own resources and deputizing its own law enforcement agencies toward the goal of arrests, detentions, deportation of immigrants. So I think that's really how they see it. And I think the executive orders also contemplate that, because a lot of what they talk about is reaching new contractual agreements, new informal agreements with state agencies to combine and pool resources toward these efforts. And one of the orders talks about every state having a federal state task force on immigration. And we're starting to see that pan out here in Texas with the recent agreement signed between the state attorney general's office and ICE to do immigration enforcement. There was a similar one signed between the state National Guard and ICE to do immigration enforcement, or CBP, I think in that case, CBP being the Border Patrol. So I imagine we'll see other states start to do the same thing. I anticipate Florida, perhaps, or other border states for sure, trying to follow suit. So Texas really wants to position itself as a leader in enabling this federal effort. Could I just jump backwards for 1 second? Because I think there's a really important point here about sort of that Jessica was getting to and Crystal was getting to about how much, when we talk about immigration now, we're talking about it in the language of national security. And it goes to your original question, is there still immigration law? I just want to say, like, the invasion rhetoric used by this administration is profoundly problematic, but it is not new. And it is part of a trend that goes back at least to the Clinton administration, if not before, where immigration, which is a civil matter, it's civil law, the court proceedings are civil proceedings, is kind of has slowly been conflated with and consumed by national security law and criminal law. And you see this with a law called IRA passed in the 90s that enhances criminal penalties for certain acts and that creates stiffer civil penalties for certain types of immigration violations. You certainly see it after 9/11 when the Immigration and Nationality Service, the INS as we used to call it, was spun off of the Department of Justice and found a new home in the Department of Homeland Security. And the subsequent ramping up of the immigration detention system after that. And then you see it now today with all the rhetoric around invasion and national security. And what that does is it just, as I said, it kind of just eats up immigration law. So now we're talking about immigration law. We're constantly talking about criminal law, detention, security, and not just the civil procedures by which somebody obtains or extends or normalizes their status within this country. And that's a huge change. And I think it's not really aligned with the realities of immigration. Just as one example, I don't have the specific numbers in front of me, but if you look at the Border Patrol keeps really good records of everybody that they apprehend along the border. And if you look at the subset of people they apprehend that they flag as potential national security concerns, it's like a 1% or a fraction of a percent of the whole number of apprehensions. So where we're saying that this is an invasion. We're saying we need the Army involved and Texas National Guard and DPS and ICE and the Border Patrol. But only a fraction of people that the Border Patrol, by their own admission, has encountered actually fit the bill of a terrorist or a national security threat.
I think when we're talking about like those statistics as well, like those numbers of apprehensions, like apprehensions are very different than like number of people encountered. Because if one person who under these new rules, right, just gets turned around, they can try to come back, right? Because they're just turned around. Let's say they try that 3 times, those are counted as 3 apprehensions,
Right.
but actually the same person.
Right. And that drives that rhetoric around, oh, there's an invasion, the numbers at the border are exploding because look, the apprehension data keeps going up. It's like, well, no, you got the same guy 5 times, and each one of those is a single data point.
Right. And that's why we saw apprehension numbers go up so significantly during a Title 42 situation, right? And I think we're probably now with these new policy changes, we're not technically a Title 42 in a Title 42 situation right now, which was really used under the public health emergency rules about COVID at the time. But I think we're now seeing really kind of a return to a Title 42-esque situation with the closing at the border and with the, the way that they're just, turning people back and not allowing any kind of lawful entries or requests for asylum.
And I think if we take the first Trump administration as a blueprint for, the continued work of this administration, I'm sure we're going to have pretty soon another Title 42 type order, and we're going to see the migrant tent courts along the border again under the Migrant Protection Protocols program. It's all going to come back, I think. And the good thing is that we're prepared. I mean, we know what we've done last time around. But again, upsetting that we're at this point again, because we know that in practice, this does not benefit anyone at all. It really is against our own self-interest and unfortunately a lot of wasted resources that could be going toward other programs like health, education, etc.
Yeah. And I guess, the concern here in Texas, as you all mentioned a little bit about the state executive orders, turning state officials into ICE agents, essentially. So now with the Attorney General's office and the entering into the 287G agreement, that we have the National Guard, the Texas National Guard being able to work alongside as CBP agents at the border. And then one of the concerns that I have, and Jess, you did a good job in analyzing the state executive orders, but the one that says here in Texas that they want to designate all appropriate state agencies as immigration enforcement officials, essentially. So what does that look like in Texas, where we're going to have federal immigration officers enforcing immigration? Then we're going to have employees, presumably now of the Attorney General's office, that are going to be enforcing immigration under 287G agreements. We have the Texas National Guard being deputized as essentially CBP or Border Patrol agents. And then now we have a very broad executive order that essentially lets the governor of our state decide which agencies, state agencies, are appropriate to designate those employees as ICE agents. What does that look like in our state where that potentially could be tens of thousands of people becoming ICE agents?
I mean, I think in practice, it's going to be chaos, right? Because it's not good for anyone. One, like residents won't know who they're dealing with, right? They don't understand the process. They don't understand what they're required to do because all of a sudden you have a mixture of like authorities, right? And I think it's also unfair to like a lot of these officers as well because they were hired to do one thing and all of a sudden they have to do something completely different that they don't have the appropriate and adequate training that's supposed to come along with this kind of authority.
Right. Didn't they specifically actually waive the training requirements in some of these?
Yes, and some of these
we're going to throw people into the system. We're not going to train them. We're just going to tell them go round up migrants or people that look like immigrants, essentially detain them and then send them off to be deported. What does that do to our communities? And not to mention, I forgot to also mention, we're dealing with federal immigration enforcement officers also in our state, but they've also reassigned DEA, ATF, and most recently IRS agents to become ICE agents as well. So, what does that look like? Again, we are really the model. I think you were right, Jess. Like, we are going to try things in Texas, see what works, see what doesn't work, and export it to the rest of the country. I mean, that's clearly what we've done with Operation Lone Star and Senate Bill 4. Um, but how does that impact our communities? We have been a very prosperous and good state to live in, because we have so many immigrants living in our state. What does it look like when we turn potentially tens of thousands of people into ICE agents? We remove people from the workforce. We haven't even gotten to the mass detention sites that they want to build here in Texas. How do you think this could transform the lives of everyday Texans?
Well, we mentioned the economic impacts earlier today. Like, I have noticed, I mean, I'm from Laredo, right? So there's like a huge percentage of folks that are just Latino, Mexican American. Mostly everyone that I know has mixed status families. There's a lot of fear among folks as well, just because also, like, we have heard reports of citizens themselves being detained as well and getting caught up, right? So, like, people
Right.
understand that this is
So
just
you're not safe even as a US citizen in this kind of environment. I mean, when we look at the prior mass deportation campaign carried out under Eisenhower, one of the statistics I read is 60% of people that were deported were US citizens. So when we throw a bunch of people into this system, tell them they have to become ICE agents, tell them they don't get any additional training, it's just, I can only imagine just people across our state, not just at the border. We don't know how this is going to really look in practice, but I can really envision a situation where our entire economy is just completely devastated.
Yeah, and those are just the economic impacts, right? Like, there's also the erosion of community, where folks are afraid to go to church, right? And because that is also one of the big job sources here along the border, it's like, do I trust my fellow churchgoer? Do I trust my son's friends' parents, right? Who might work at a law enforcement agency that maybe wasn't doing immigration work before, but now under these agreements they are, right? So yes, I mean, that I have seen that already play out in the short 3 weeks where people are coming to me saying, like, I just don't feel safe anymore. And that also just makes us generally unsafe as well. Like, if people don't trust going to law enforcement to pursue a case, that just as a community, it makes us less safe as a whole.
It feels
There's
like
like
COVID all over. Sorry. Just I was thinking about the community part that, we as immigration advocates have been doing a lot of work in educating community members about their rights and having clinics and workshops. And historically, you would want those to be in person because it's a chance to exchange information more freely and make connections. And there's something about being in the room with somebody to that builds trust and reassurance. But a lot of us are saying, well, we don't feel comfortable advising people to congregate in a space anymore to get this information because of the security concern. So all of a sudden we're all back to Zoom, and what does that damage does that do to communities and community ties and networks in the long term if this is the new normal where we have to all be meeting on our phones or our laptops again?
the other side of that coin is what does it do like to culture when you have just a bunch of people whose job it is to suss out, who's here documented and who's not, and that's their new job. There's like we see rises, we are already seeing this, the rise of like vigilantism, people feeling like they can get out there and they can be immigration enforcement. And, we've seen people charged with felony kidnapping because they pretended to be ICE and knocked on doors. And when it could be virtually anywhere. It could be a plainclothes cop. It could be, a deputized attorney general attorney who worked with the Texas. When we have so many different cooks in the kitchen doing the same job, it's how is a person supposed to know if
Right.
the person at their door is doing a legitimate law enforcement business or not?
Within a week or so of the election, there were rumors that I think were ultimately corroborated in Austin about neighborhood associations essentially setting bounties up for people who could report undocumented communities to ICE. I worked a lot in my past life as an immigration lawyer with asylum seekers, and it reminds me so much of what they would describe to me in their home countries, where you can't trust your neighbor, you don't know who's informing on who. It's really,
Yeah.
it's very unsettling.
It is. My mom is Cuban, and she would tell us stories about that. Living in a communist society where you have to be really cautious. You can't trust neighbors. You can't trust the officials in the government because people are watching and reporting. And it's a big concern that, what that does to communities, what that does to friendships, what that does to families, what that does to school and other community settings. If everybody's either worried about getting snitched on or worried about having to snitch on others, like what does that do? And how can that really break down the fabric of a society pretty quickly? What does it look like at the end of all of this? I think that's my concern. There's a lot that has been written on paper that y'all have done such an amazing job analyzing and going through. But a lot of this is just so far paper, right? I mean, I think there have been an increase in terms of ICE apprehensions on the interior, but because they don't have the resources they need to do 20 million deportations right now, they're targeting certain people they claim that have either criminal histories or final deportation orders, but then also getting whoever are the collaterals, they call them, which is people that don't have criminal histories and people that don't have final deportation orders if they happen to live in the same house or be at the same space. They're just rounding people up with no enforcement priorities whatsoever. So what does that mean? I know that there was previous guidance on these enforcement priorities, and part of these executive orders also took that away as well. So what does that mean? Are they really going after criminals? What does that mean?
Well, I think you kind of touched on it. Is they an operation and enforcement action might start on the premise that they're arresting an individual that they're aware of, either because they have previously shown up for ICE check-ins, or because they have a removal order that's outstanding, or because they have criminal history, and that makes it easy for ICE to identify them and go after them. But now there's really nothing restricting them from arresting anybody else they encounter in that process. And that was true under the previous administration, but there were still enforcement guidelines, as you mentioned, that said, look, crime victims are not a priority for removal. People with U.S. citizen children are not a priority for removal. Those advisals, those policies are gone now. So there's nothing stopping an ICE agent, except perhaps for their own conscience, from arresting anybody that they believe to be in the country without permission. And yes, that starts with somebody who might have committed a deportable offense or have a removal order, but it doesn't end there. And I think we're going to see more and more arrests like that as this effort keeps going. I think it's important to remember that we're still not even a full month into this administration, so we don't really know what it will look like in 3 months or 6 months or a year from now.
And I think the other thing that I think folks don't expect with an increase of detention in the interior is it's going to cause even more backlogs in the immigration courts. Like we already have so many cases in the backlog. And it is a right of someone who demonstrates that they have lived here longer than 2 years to see an immigration judge to determine whether they're going to remove or be allowed protection here in the United States. And that just turns into another case, right? And if we're going to see this continued enforcement in the interior of the United States, where it's probably a lot of people who have lived here for longer than 2 years, it's just going to be even more cases in front of immigration judges.
And you mentioned about the 2 years. Why is that time limit important?
A time limit is important because we have a process here in the United States, or a mechanism called expedited removal. So that's basically just summary deportation without the right to see a judge. So if you've been here before, one of these memos that got rescinded, the directive was that if you've been here in the United States for 14 days and within 100 miles of the border, you are subject to expedited removal. So it was only that group of folks that
It was really designed to get at people who had just crossed between a port, for
Exactly.
example, that were close to the border, that had just entered. And it was a mechanism where I guess you could just turn them back rather quickly under this expedited removal process, right?
But it wasn't,
Right.
yeah, but it wasn't like catch and release, because
Right.
that's like an actual deportation order. Somebody who gets expeditiously removed, it
That's
has a
considered a
deportation.
deportation.
Right.
So it used to have that limit. And what happened after the Trump administration came in?
So it basically expanded the program to what is allowed under US statute, right? Which is 2 years anywhere in the country. So you have to have in order to not be removed without the chance of seeing a judge, you have to show that you've been here in the US for longer than 2 years.
And what's frightening about this kind of round of the expansion of expedited removal, because we've seen it before under the previous Trump administration as well, is the ICE is interpreting the law to apply to people who may have been admitted to the country on a provisional status. So those CHNV beneficiaries that Crystal was mentioning earlier, if they haven't in the period after they were admitted or paroled into the country, applied for some other type of status and received that status, they are now potentially subject to expedited removal based on ICE's interpretation as well. So even people who applied from abroad, proved up that they had a sponsor in the US,
Did it the right way.
did it the right way, they could be subject to removal without a hearing. I was working with an individual just recently who is in the asylum process, but right now they've applied, they've gone to 2 interviews, they are awaiting a decision, but they entered on this program, and it's concerning to me because even though they're going through this process, they're still subject to expedited removal potentially if they find themselves at a checkpoint or a traffic stop gone awry.
Right. And who's making these determinations, like whether or not expedited removal should apply? Who's making these determinations? How is it going to be concluded that the person has been here less than 2 years? Or what happens like on the spot if they can't prove they've been here for longer than 2 years?
Essentially left to ICE because there's no automatic judicial review of these decisions. So
So we're talking about ICE agents on the ground.
right.
We're also in Texas talking about untrained members of the National Guard. We're talking about potentially untrained members of the Attorney General's office. And under these state executive orders, we're also talking about whoever are the appropriate state agency employees making these determinations as
Right.
well.
And
And as a-
CBP,
and
CBP
CBP.
also along the
And
border.
CBP.
And just a note for our listeners, maybe not our watchers, anytime you hear us say the right way, we're usually doing it in air quotes, just given that in practice, there really isn't, it doesn't
Right.
matter, right?
I feel like the tone. I feel like they can see the air quotes with the tone the right way.
I think
hope
you
so.
said it. You set the tone with that early. But what's concerning too is, I mean, this isn't universally true, but because we are a border state and a significant number of the people we're talking about are Mexican nationals, this expedited removal process can happen in a matter of hours. There isn't any time to turn around and challenge this before somebody could potentially have been deported, with the actual legal effects of a deportation, as Crystal mentioned. If you are a national of another country, it could take longer. But you're going to be detained for that period of time, and it will be difficult to even prove that you're not subject to expedited removal under those conditions. But there really isn't space under this order and this law for people to protest if they don't have all of their papers in a row in their glove compartment ready to go, or even if they do, if ICE chooses to not look at them or a sheriff chooses to not look at them, there's really no recourse.
And the chaos that this could cause in the event that SB 4 comes back, is like huge because you have situations where people might be expeditiously removed and they are there wasn't time to figure out that they derived citizenship, for example, from like a parent or something. And so they got expeditiously removed. They come back unlawfully, and now they're subject to a felony under SB4 that has no provision for what somebody's status is. It's just, did you come back after a removal? Are you present in Texas after a removal? So
And
luckily that's not in effect right now, but like you can imagine expanding expedited removal to its fullest extent plus having these felony provisions under SB4 in Texas would be a nightmare.
right. And we're starting to see, I've been saying, oh, it's especially risky for Mexican citizens who are caught up in this. But actually, one of the other things the Trump administration is doing, and it's something that they started to do the last time around, was sign agreements with third countries to accept deportees, people being deported who aren't of that country. So we're already hearing reports of, I think it was something like 100. I can't remember their nationality now, but there was a flight that was landed in Panama of people who were not Panamanian. And we're hearing similar stories about Venezuelan being deported elsewhere, or Bengalis being deported back to Mexico. So really, we can't even say that non-Mexican nationals subject to expedited removal will have more time to challenge their cases.
And if it happens like somewhere like here in Laredo, it literally just takes like they just take you to the bridge and that's it. Like it literally can happen in a matter of hours.
And there's your deportation, right? And then what happens if you had something pending? What happens if you had an asylum claim pending?
Right.
What happens if you had a petition to adjust status through, for example, a U.S. citizen spouse pending? What would happen to that immigration case at that point?
It varies a
It's-
lot. I mean,
Yeah. If you have an affirmative case, let's say you've applied for permanent residence or something like that, it's gone. You can't leave the country without advance permission with one of these pending affirmative cases without abandoning it.
in some cases, you might be able to sue if you can prove that there is tortious activity involved. Tortious is a legal term for just damaging activity committed by the government, or maybe you can communicate with the appropriate personnel within ICE to bring that person back. But effectively, it's very unlikely that that's going to happen.
Yeah. And there are like changes in strategy, even for people who do have, you can maybe apply from outside, do something called the consular process. It does change. You probably need a waiver for the deportation now, and it does change your case from being like a year-long case to get your green card to now being more like a 5 to 6 year.
Or longer, because we're going to start seeing consular staff lose their jobs.
Right, right.
And if you're confused right now because you're listening and we're talking all this stuff, that's the point, because it's like you probably end up having the same training as someone who is a Texas officer who just got waived and with the training and got deputized, and they also don't know the
But
difference.
remember, they're not going to give training. There was actually in the MOU that Texas National Guard had to sign. They literally, in the MOU, it says they're going to waive training.
So they waived the training. You have the same amount of training, which is 0, to do this kind of work. It's like, do you know what if someone had just applied for a U visa and already got their a bona fide determination? Is that person in legal status? Like, what about someone who just applied for adjustment of status and already got the receipt? Is that legal status? What about someone that has DACA here in Texas? Is that legal? Like, there's just so many different things that like an immigration officer should know. And now we're having a bunch of folks getting deputized, adding additional piles of work to the work that they already have with 0 training. I'm sure it's going to go well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that just kind of leads me back to the same question we started with, is like, what are really the point? What is the point to any of these immigration laws if, one, we're not following them? We know asylum is a protected right, but we've just done away with that with the signing of an executive order. We talked about, Bobby, you mentioned about the refugee resettlement program. This is a program that we've had. You in your prior role did a lot of work with refugees, and like you said, those are people that wait for years to do it the right way. They are vetted heavily, did away with that. We're doing away with, the expedited removal, or we're expanding it, but we're also making it so that it's going to operate in a way that creates the most amount of confusion possible for those that are trying to enforce laws and those that are the recipients of that. I mean, again, what is the point of having any of these laws? Do we have immigration law anymore? What are people supposed to do?
And I think the frustrating part is that a lot of the folks driving these kinds of policies shield themselves behind this narrative about protecting the rule of law. But like we see how it's actually playing out in the immigration context where the rule of law is not being protected. And instead, we have a bunch of executive orders that are just unilateral decisions on behalf of the administration, making all these changes that Congress didn't approve. And to me, it's like, well, if they're doing this with immigration, can't it happen with other areas of the law too? And the answer is yes, right? Like if they're doing this, it establishes dangerous precedent for all sorts of issues and laws affecting us as people here in the United States.
Someone once told me early on in my legal career that law is fundamentally about the management of power. And if you no longer have a system that effectively manages power and checks the power of an enforcement agency or a judge or somebody else, then where is the rule of law at that point?
Yeah. Well, I think that I know we've kind of gone through the bigger themes of all of these executive orders. Is there anything else that jumps out? I know we haven't even gotten a chance to talk about a potential new, we saw a Muslim ban in Trump 1.0. I think we can expect we're going to have, after the 60-day kind of review period, I think we're going to have another travel ban, and who knows what countries those are going to include. We have, the military related executive orders. We have the refugee admissions program abolishment, we talked a little bit about birthright citizenship being taken away. What else jumps out at you all to highlight for our listeners? And I guess what other things can we be doing here in Texas to try to help?
Let's talk
our
about the
communities.
birthright citizenship.
Yeah, I think go for it. Or should
Yeah.
You were the one who did the deep dive.
I did.
You should set it up for sure.
Well, sure. No, I mean, I think the first thing is like one thing about birthright citizenship and a handful of these other policies that we need to clarify is that a lot of these are being fought out in the courts right now. So it only adds to the confusion because some of these policies are in effect. Some have been stopped by a judge temporarily, indefinitely. It depends. So it is really important, though, to say that the birthright citizenship executive order has been enjoined by, I think, at least 2 federal courts at this point. Enjoined meaning told it can't go into effect until this.
What are some of the things those judges have said about?
I think they were, both just kind of aghast at how patently unconstitutional that executive order is. I remember reading it on the 20th or the 21st and thinking they're just making stuff up. They're like this there's no basis for this argument at all. And what the argument being basically carving out children of undocumented parents.
And it's not just undocumented, right?
Right.
Talk a little bit about, we know that Project 2025 wanted to get rid of birthright citizenship for a long time, but we're not even just talking about children born on U.S. soil to undocumented parents, right? Like it's much farther than that. It goes much farther than that as well, right?
It certainly includes parents who were admitted on types of non-immigrant status, like visitors visas, student visas,
H-1B visa,
H-1B worker visas. Essentially, yeah, anything that isn't a permanent resident, effectively, asylees, refugees. It would apply to all of them. But I think the important thing to note is that there's just no basis in the wording of the 14th Amendment or U.S. law that gives the executive branch the authority to do anything like this. And the judges who saw these cases were just kind of throwing up their hands saying, like, what on earth are you doing? I was on a call the other day with one of the lawyers who litigated one of these cases, and he said it was kind of pathetic watching the U.S. attorneys be put in the position of having to defend this order because there's just nothing they can say. They don't have anything to retort with.
I think that, yeah, the quote that I read was like the judge saying, where were the attorneys on this? Like, where were the lawyers when he was signing stuff? And I think because most people would recognize that it's the plain language of the Constitution says that if you're born in this country, you're a U.S. citizen. And from what I'm reading, it seems like the makeshift legal argument is that somehow people who are non-immigrants in the U.S., undocumented folks and people on non-immigrant visas are not subject to the laws of the United States or subject to jurisdiction of the United States, which is very interesting to then also on the other side be saying that they're breaking laws of the United States.
So I'm fairly certain, I have to go back and look at my history books to guarantee this, but I'm fairly certain that was referring to diplomats and their children.
Yes, diplomats. You have diplomatic immunity. Exactly.
But, given how kind of ridiculous the premise of that order is, it makes me wonder, was the point really to revoke birthright citizenship? Maybe yes, in a dream world, but in the interim, it certainly does a lot of what all of you have already talked about, which is create confusion, create fear. It gives the federal government an opportunity to undermine the infrastructure that supports families, mixed status families, immigrant families in this country, U.S. citizens born here under the Constitution. Because what they really do, the way this is going to be implemented was federal agencies were just going to stop recognizing the citizenship of people who fall into this category. They know they can't change the Constitution unilaterally, but they can tell the Social Security Administration to stop issuing Social Security cards to people who were born to parents who weren't residents or citizens. And whether or not that's ultimately found constitutional, it's very unlikely that it would be found constitutional. In the interim, it just further blurs the lines and further abstracts the laws around immigration to the point where, is there immigration law anymore?
And also, don't you also think it's a messaging tool about who really belongs here?
Yeah,
in this
it's
country,
a tool to other. Yeah,
it's a tool to other. We've heard people such as Stephen Miller talk about America being for Americans only. I think it just, if anything, a clearly unconstitutional executive order, if anything, is a good messaging tool. And I think that's what we need to take from that, is that is their message. That is who they are kind of drawing the line between who belongs in America and who doesn't.
And speaking of messaging, I feel like it goes to the greater, that the other enhanced messaging we've been seeing of the conflation of migration and criminalization, criminalizing migration. And the more you make them seem like they're criminals, whether they're not, that's actually based in fact, because obviously if somebody,
we know it's not based in
right,
fact.
we know it's not based in fact. People who overstay a visa are not committing any crime whatsoever. There's no crime about overstaying a visa. People who enter unlawfully have committed what's the equivalent of Texas of a Class B misdemeanor, like public intoxication, and it has a statute of limitations of a couple of years. You can't actually go after a lot of folks who might have crossed without permission criminally.
Punishable by a fine in most cases.
Right. We know that this isn't real, but it doesn't matter if it's based in fact or not. The more that you can other someone, the more you can make people feel no empathy or compassion because they're criminals, the more you can do to them, and people won't say or do anything about it. And I think this administration really, they got their, the one time that people had a problem with their anti-immigrant agenda was when they did family separation. And I think they learned from that. And I was hoping that what they would learn from that was not to do family separation again. And I think instead what they learned was we need to do a better job of othering, and we need to do a better job of making sure that the American public generally doesn't feel sympathy towards migrant families, so that it's okay to separate them.
And I'm glad you brought up family separation because, while we're not seeing that tactic being used currently, one of the executive orders does mandate that the Department of Justice prioritize prosecution of that statute that you mentioned, the unlawful entry statute, and that was the very mechanism, the extensive use of prosecution in that context to separate families in the first place. So there is a risk now that the groundwork has been laid for family separation to happen again.
Well, I guess it's really about what the American public is going to like, how they're going to find their day-to-day lives be impacted by all of the things that we talked about. Where is that line that is going to be crossed that's too far for most people? And what are people going to do about it? So I know we've talked a lot of doom and gloom today. Is there anything as we wrap up our first podcast, Sidebar Immigration? Is there anything hopeful or positive that we can wrap with, or no? Where can we go with all of this?
There's a lot of talk in the media about kind of a malaise generally in the public in terms of reacting to these measures, but I haven't seen that personally within our community. I feel like there's been extensive organization, mobilization, communication around how to push back and how to parse through all of these things and get ready and challenge them. And that's been very energizing for me personally.
Yeah. I think for me, it's been surrounding myself with community. Like I mentioned to the team, I usually attend my mom's prayer groups on Thursday, and just without me having to say anything, but like just hearing what they're talking about. And folks that are usually so busy, trying to make ends meet and like, provide for their family and et cetera, even folks that do have status, like them bringing this up and just talking about the negative effects and that they don't agree with it, I think to me has been in a way, I guess, validating, right? Where folks are noticing these changes, whereas before, or whereas they're usually just so busy, right? That they don't have the chance to really keep up with the news, but they are. And I hope that this means that, folks are going to continue or get plugged into the organizing efforts to stop this, because it is essentially affecting our state and our country and our community and our loved ones and ourselves. And I also just want to take a chance to plug in our resources. We talked about the summaries that we have been working on for the federal and the state executive orders are up on our website on txilc.org under the resource library. We have a lot of resources there in English and Spanish. You can check out the summaries of each of the executive orders that we have worked on, and also key takeaways for community members on what this specific executive order means for you here in Texas, and things that you should be doing to protect yourself and your loved ones as well.
Crystal, what about you? Any
Oh,
hopeful
man.
or closing thoughts?
Oh, hopeful thoughts. I think I've been really energized by the energy and the people that have come forward, non-traditional allies that have come forward and identified that this doesn't sit right with them, that they feel like their conscience is troubled by what they see going on. And I think that's important and huge. And I also really, it's awful. There's a lot of things happening. It's really terrible. I don't like the rhetoric, but we've been here before. And all of these plans have been broadcast for so long that we really are prepared. We really have been thinking through scenario planning and what this looks like and what are possible challenges and how do we get words out how do we organize communities? How do we make sure they know their rights? So I appreciate that it doesn't feel like we've been surprised. It does feel like we were able to put plans in motion that we've had drafted for a few months already.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you all more. I mean, I've had so many just kind of people that don't think about immigration, that don't care about immigration in the way that we do day in and day out for our professional lives, reach out to me, even people that were Trump supporters and that voted for him, to say, wait a sec, I'm worried. I thought he was just going to go after the criminals. What's happening? What about my so and so, my friend, my neighbor, my housekeeper? I've had so many people reach out to me and say, what can we do? I'm worried. I didn't think it was going to be like this. And I
I
think
didn't vote
that
for that.
is exactly, they don't
Yeah.
want this. This isn't what they wanted. And I think, unfortunately, I don't think we've seen the depths of this yet, because as we mentioned in the podcast, we've just talked about a lot of things that are on paper that haven't actually been operationalized yet. And as we are, again, getting ready in our state to have mass deportation camps at our southern border, what that's going to look like when people that are concerned about their family, their friends, their loved ones, their colleagues, when they start getting sent to those camps. So I think unfortunately we haven't seen, we have not seen the end of this. And it is really horrifying to think about where and how this is going to play out. But the only silver lining that I see to any of this, aside from the organizing and working with communities, is that after everything is destroyed and burns to the ground, we are going to have a chance to build back a better and more resilient and workable common sense immigration system. So I could not um, be more happy to be in community with you all as we continue through this uncharted territory. And I'm so pleased to have you all today on the podcast. I also wanted to shout out a special thanks to our production team for making this possible. They're so awesome. So, thanks to all the listeners. This is going to be a limited series, so savor these very, very much. You're not going to get many, but we look forward to doing the next one. And thanks, y'all, so much. Happy